The wind rolled across the Arizona plains like a restless spirit, carrying dust and the smell of dry grass. Samuel Hartley stood near the corral, his hat pulled low against the sun. He was a man of quiet habits, one who spoke more to his horses than to people. The land had made him hard, not cruel, but silent and distant. Years alone on a ranch could turn even a kind heart into stone. Samuel had built everything with his own hands: the small wooden house, the fences, the barn. Each board carried a memory, but none were as heavy as the memories of those he had lost. His wife, Mary, had died of fever 5 years before, and his younger brother, Luke, had been killed years earlier during a clash with Apache tribes. The townsfolk had told him, "The Apaches can't be trusted," and in his pain he believed them. From that day forward he lived by one rule: never help an Apache. The sky that evening turned dark with clouds. Rain was coming, the kind that made the earth smell alive again. Samuel finished feeding the horses and went inside to light his lamp. But just as he sat down to eat, a strange sound broke through the rain, a faint cry almost swallowed by the wind. He paused, fork in hand, listening. There it was again, softer this time. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside. The rain was falling harder now, thick drops beating against his hat. As he walked toward the water trough, his boots sank into the mud. Then he saw her, a small figure lying near the fence, barely moving. At first he thought it might be a traveler or a child lost from a nearby camp. But when he came closer and saw the beads and patterns on her torn clothing, his breath caught. She was Apache. Samuel froze. His first thought was to walk away. Helping her could mean trouble. For him, for his ranch, maybe even for the peace he had left in his quiet life. The girl tried to lift her head. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please, I am not your enemy." The words struck him like a hammer to the chest. He had not expected her to speak English. He looked at her, rain dripping from his hat brim, his lantern lighting her face. And for a moment he saw not an Apache, but a frightened young girl who could barely breathe. He told himself to leave her. That was the smart thing to do. The safe thing? He turned, took 2 steps toward the barn, but something inside stopped him. Maybe it was the way her voice shook, or maybe it was the ghost of his wife whispering in his heart. Don't turn away from kindness. He sighed heavily, cursed his own weakness under his breath, and knelt beside the girl. She was cold to the touch, soaked to the skin, and trembling. Samuel knew she wouldn't survive the night out there. He lifted her gently and carried her to the barn. His horse snorted as the door creaked open. He laid her on a bed of dry hay, wrapped an old blanket around her, and fetched water from a bucket. Her eyes fluttered open again. "Why, help me?" she asked in a faint voice. He didn't answer. He didn't know how. He poured water into her mouth carefully and watched her swallow. The moment felt unreal. The same man who once swore never to help an Apache was now saving one. He looked at her for a long time, trying to see what danger she carried, but all he saw was pain. There was a cut on her arm, not deep but enough to make her weak. He cleaned it quietly with a cloth dipped in rainwater. The girl flinched at first but didn't pull away. When he finished, he left her there, closing the barn door behind him. Back inside, Samuel sat by the fire, staring at the flames. The rain roared on the roof, but his mind was louder. He argued with himself. "What are you doing, Sam? You're helping one of them, after what they did to Luke." He tried to push away the thought, but he couldn't. The image of the girl's face kept returning, her eyes filled with fear and trust at the same time. He rubbed his temples, sighed again, and finally lay down, though he barely slept that night. By morning, the rain had stopped. The land smelled fresh and clean. Samuel walked to the barn, half expecting to find the girl gone. But she was still there, sitting up now, wrapped in the blanket. She looked weaker but smiled faintly when she saw him. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice was fragile but warm. He stood by the door, unsure what to say. He handed her a piece of bread and a cup of water. "Eat," he muttered, turning to check on his horses. After a moment, she whispered, "My name is Nayeli." Samuel nodded but didn't reply. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know her story. The more he knew, the harder it would be to let her go. But Nayeli spoke again, slowly, as if she wanted him to understand she meant no harm. She told him her family had been traveling toward the mountains when soldiers attacked their camp. She had run, lost her way, and wandered for days before collapsing near his ranch. Samuel said nothing. He didn't want to believe her, but her words didn't sound like lies. There was sorrow in her voice, and the kind only truth could carry. Over the next few days, she grew stronger. She helped around the barn, brushed the horses, and thanked him each morning in her own language. Samuel noticed her carefulness. She never took more than she needed, never touched what wasn't hers. Slowly, his mistrust began to fade. One evening, while the sun set behind the hills, Nayeli stood near the fence, watching the sky turn gold. Samuel joined her without speaking. For a long moment, they just looked at the horizon. Then she said quietly, "You are kind even when your heart says no." Samuel didn't know how to answer. Maybe she was right. He had done what he thought he never would, broken his own code. The world had taught him that kindness toward the wrong person could cost everything, yet he felt no regret. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of a truth he had long forgotten. Mercy is not weakness. That night, as he closed the barn door, Samuel looked back at the girl lying peacefully under his roof. He thought about what the townsfolk would say if they found out. They'd call him a fool, maybe worse. But as he blew out the lamp, one thought stayed in his mind. He had already crossed the line between hate and compassion. There was no going back now. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass. Inside, a broken man and a lost girl slept under the same roof, both carrying wounds that only kindness could heal. For the first time in many years, Samuel felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not guilt, but a quiet sense of peace. It was the beginning of a change he never saw coming. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet ranch began to feel different. The air that once carried only the sound of wind and animals now carried soft human voices. One deep and gruff, the other gentle and uncertain. Samuel had never been a man of many words, but around Nayeli, silence began to lose its meaning. She filled it with stories, small laughter, and questions about the world beyond his fences. Sometimes she asked about the stars, sometimes about the horses, and sometimes about the people in the town he always avoided. He would answer briefly, but even his short replies made her smile. Every morning, Samuel found her already awake, sweeping the barn floor or gathering kindling. She worked with care, never asking for anything in return. There was a lightness about her, even though her life had known nothing but loss. He admired that strength quietly. Each time she thanked him, he wanted to say he didn't deserve her gratitude, that he had spent years hating the very people she came from. But the words never came out. He only nodded and let her think what she wanted. One afternoon, as he was repairing the fence, he saw a dust cloud far off in the distance. His heart tightened. That kind of dust meant riders, too many to be harmless travelers. He motioned for Nayeli to stay inside and watched from behind the barn as the riders approached. When they came close enough, he recognized them. Soldiers, 3 of them. They rode straight up to his porch, their boots heavy against the wood. The man in front, wearing a badge that glinted in the sun, called out, "Hartley, you around?" Samuel stepped forward slowly, his hand brushing against his belt out of habit. "What brings you here, Sheriff?" he asked, recognizing the voice. It was Dugan, his old friend, the one who had stood beside him at Luke's grave years ago. "Search party," Dugan said, looking tired but alert. "Word is, one of the Apache girls escaped the camp a few days back. Some say she's wounded hiding near these parts." His eyes drifted toward the barn. "You seen anything unusual lately?" Samuel felt his heartbeat quicken, but he kept his face calm. "Just the usual. Coyotes, storms, and long days," he said, forcing a dry smile. Dugan studied him. "You'd tell me if you did, wouldn't you? You know what kind of trouble it could bring." Samuel didn't answer at first. He looked past Dugan toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and endless. "Maybe sometimes trouble ain't what we think it is," he said quietly. The sheriff gave a slow nod, though it was clear he didn't quite understand what Samuel meant. After a few more minutes of talk, the men rode away, leaving dust in their wake. Samuel didn't move until they were gone from sight. Then he turned and hurried to the barn. Nayeli was hiding in the loft, her eyes wide with fear. "They're gone," he said softly. "You're safe for now." She climbed down, shaking. They would take me away." He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. "That's why you can't stay here anymore. It's not safe for either of us. She looked down, silent. There was sadness in her eyes, but also understanding. "Where will I go?" Samuel sighed and walked toward his horse. "North," he said. "Toward the mountains. Your people might be out there. I'll take you part of the way." That night they packed what little they had: dried bread, a canteen of water, and a blanket. The stars were sharp and bright above them as they rode quietly away from the ranch. The land was open and endless, silver in the moonlight. Samuel hadn't traveled far from home in years, but the journey felt strangely right. They spoke little as they rode. Sometimes Naili hummed softly, an Apache tune that rose and fell like the wind. Samuel didn't understand the words, but the melody carried peace. It reminded him of evenings long ago when Mary used to sing while making supper. He realized that for the first time in many years he didn't feel empty. By dawn they reached a rocky pass where the land began to rise. Samuel stopped the horse and looked around. "We'll rest here," he said. They sat by a stream, sharing what little food they had. Nayeli's face glowed in the morning light, and for a moment, Samuel saw how young she really was. Just a girl trying to survive in a world that called her an enemy. Later that day, as they prepared to move again, they heard hoofbeats in the distance. Samuel's stomach turned cold. Soldiers. There was no time to run far. He led the horse behind a cluster of rocks and pulled Nayeli down beside him. The sound grew louder, voices, metal, and movement. He could see their outlines on the ridge above. Nayeli looked at him, whispering, "You should go. If they find you with me, they will call you traitor." He shook his head. "I ain't leaving you." His voice was steady, calm. "If they see me, I'll talk. You keep still no matter what." The riders passed by, dust swirling behind them. One of them stopped for a moment, looking around. Samuel held his breath. Then, just as quickly, the man kicked his horse and rode on. When the sound faded, Samuel finally exhaled. Nayeli looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Why risk everything for me?" He thought about it before answering. "Because someone should have done it a long time ago." They traveled for 2 more days. The land grew wilder, the mountains taller. Each night they camped under the open sky, sharing stories. Nayeli spoke of her village, of her mother who wove blankets with bright red threads, of her father who taught her to listen to the wind. Samuel told her about Mary, about how the ranch once felt alive before loneliness took over. In those stories, they found pieces of comfort neither had felt in years. On the 3rd morning, they reached a narrow valley filled with cottonwood trees. Samuel knew this was where their paths would part. The trail beyond led deep into Apache territory. He stopped the horse and looked at Nayeli. "This is as far as I go," he said quietly. Nayeli nodded, though her eyes were wet. She stepped down from the horse and looked around as if the earth itself was whispering to her. "My family may be near," she said softly. Then she turned to Samuel. "You saved me. You gave me life again." He smiled faintly. "No, you reminded me what it means to be human." He reached into his pocket and took out a small silver locket, the one his wife used to wear. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "For luck." She hesitated, then accepted it carefully, holding it close to her heart. "I will never forget," she said. "You have heart like river, strong but kind." Samuel watched as she walked toward the trees until her figure disappeared in the golden morning light. For a long time he stood there, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Then he turned his horse and began the long ride back home. When he reached the ranch, everything was the same. The house, the fences, the silence. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. He moved slower, spoke softer, and for the first time he didn't feel angry when he looked toward the hills where the Apache lived. The townsfolk noticed a change in him. Some said the old rancher had lost his mind, that the loneliness had finally gotten to him. Others whispered that he had betrayed his kind. Samuel never answered those whispers. He went about his days as before, but each evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, he would stand by the fence and stare into the distance. Somewhere out there, a girl named Nayeli was alive and free. That was enough. He no longer saw enemies or strangers in the shadows, only people, each trying to survive the same hard world. And every time he remembered her trembling voice saying, "Please, I am not your enemy," his heart softened a little more. Years later, long after the ranch grew quiet again, Samuel would still walk to that same spot at sunset. He would take off his hat, feel the wind brush his face, and smile faintly. Because in that single act of mercy, he had found something greater than pride, greater than hate. He had found peace, the kind that comes not from winning, but from finally understanding that kindness is the truest form of strength. And somewhere beyond those distant hills, perhaps a grown woman wearing a silver locket would look to the same sky and whisper a prayer for the rancher, who once chose compassion over fear.